sometimes the workings of karma in Buddhism can seem a little bit obscure and difficult to understand, and I wouldn't say we need to take all of it literally. After all, even the Buddha himself said that not everything that we do is due to our karma, or not everything that happens to us is due to our karma. Nevertheless, there are some, I think, deep psychological insights that we can find in the Buddha's understanding of karmic cause and effect. For example, how is it that our impure intentions, our unskillful states of mind, end up causing us suffering and misery? There's a really interesting case that I discussed in a recent video, or I mentioned in a recent video, but I want to discuss it today in more detail. This is the case that I'll call the miser's regret. In several early suttas, the Buddha discusses a miser or misers, plural. It's not clear whether it's the same person in each sutta, but nevertheless, misers, or a miser who essentially die childless, and so their great fortunes end up going to the king's own coffers. They're not distributed to people in order to enjoy. And this, the Buddha feels, is a shame. In the Buddha's eyes, these fortunes are essentially wasted. And one of these suttas discusses a miser who is in fact generous during his lifetime, but who eventually has regrets about that generosity. The Buddha, in fact, describes this case to King Pasenadi of Kosala, and this is what he says. Once upon a time, great king, that financier householder provided alms food on behalf of a lone Buddha named Tagarasiki. He instructed, give alms to that ascetic before getting up from his seat and leaving. But after giving, he regretted it. It would have been better to feed the bondservants or workers with that alms food. Because that financier provided Tagarashiki with alms food, as a result of that deed, he was reborn 7 times in a good place, a heavenly realm. But because that financier regretted giving alms, as a result of that deed, his mind didn't tend to enjoy nice food, clothes, vehicles, or the 5 refined kinds of sensual stimulation. Now, I think this is a psychologically fascinating window on the workings of karma. Now, first, we should remain aware, we should be aware that this deed that this financier did was, in fact, positive. It was beneficial. The Buddha says that he's going to be reborn in a heavenly realm because of it. Now, we can take this literally, as many people do within Buddhism, or we can take it figuratively, that any generous deed we do is going to come back to us most likely in benefits to ourselves later on in this lifetime. For the Buddha, any generosity is beneficial, even generosity that is tainted somehow. Now that's relatively straightforward, but the interesting thing here is the regret. Now, what is it like to give generously and then regret it afterwards? To begin with, there's a case where perhaps the person that we give them the donation to behaves badly somehow. Perhaps they behave in a way that we hadn't expected. Perhaps they misuse what we've given them. That's a clear case where we might regret being generous, but that's not the case in front of us here. Or perhaps we can think of a case where we have a limited amount of wealth. Perhaps we're not that wealthy, and we give money to one person, and then realize perhaps that that same money, that little money that we have, would have been better given to somebody else. That's understandable as well, but once again, that's not the case in front of us. This is a financier with a load of money. He was loaded in the Buddha's understanding. He had plenty to give. Rather, in this case of the miser's regret, the problem was a sort of an unsteady ability to be generous. It's rather that this wealth he was giving, this generosity, could have gone to the ascetic, which is to say to somebody who could not help this miser directly, going to pure generosity, or the miser, we might say, could have reinvested it in his business by giving it to his employees, his servants, people who were going to help him. In a sense, We could say he's giving it to his business rather than giving it to somebody who could not help him. That was that's more accurately the distinction before him. Now, we may legitimately say that in either case, we're being generous to somebody. Either we're giving it to an ascetic, or we're giving it to workers and servants. In either way, we're being generous somehow. But nevertheless, the question is, what is the state of our mind psychologically after we have been generous? Do we allow ourselves to be generous without second guessing? Or do we habitually think to ourselves after having been generous that we could have used that wealth better in other ways? The latter path is one where we may find ourselves incapable of really letting ourselves go and enjoying ourselves with others as well. So, for example, we may take friends and family out to a nice dinner. We may spend some wealth on that dinner, but then regret it afterwards and think, that was a lot of money to spend on a dinner, a lot of money just to spend on enjoying ourselves. I could have better spent that money reinvesting it in my business, paying my employees, doing something that would have helped me more directly in the future. Now, to repeat a point that I made earlier, it's essential in these cases that we really are able to afford what we're doing. Of course, if we're taking our family out to a dinner that we can't really afford, that's a different case. What we're talking about is somebody who is, again, loaded. They've got plenty of funds to be able to afford whatever they want. It's just that they're not able to enjoy themselves. So the Buddha says, because that financier regretted giving alms, as a result of that deed, his mind didn't tend to enjoy nice food, clothes, vehicles, or the 5 refined kinds of sensual stimulation. Now, in this sutta, it's sort of set up as a causal influence, that the regret caused him not to be able to enjoy nice things later on in life. But I think more accurately, psychologically, there is a single cause for both the regret and the inability to enjoy things in life. This is this tendency towards greed, tendency towards being miserly, that essentially we all have to some degree or another. And it's that tendency to want to keep things for ourselves that both makes some people tend to second guess being generous or not be able to be generous, and in the same way allows those same people not really to be able to enjoy the normal sense pleasures of life. And that's because these pleasures tend to be costly. They tend to involve some expenditure of our closely guarded wealth. And if we identify strongly with that wealth, we're not going to want to spend it. We're not going to want to let it go. Now, I would submit that this kind of way of living is not happy. It's a way of life that tends towards misery and suffering. It also makes friendships more difficult because, of course, friendships are built on this kind of mutual generosity, this ability to enjoy ourselves with other people. And to the extent that we are miserly with our wealth, miserly with what we think is ours, we're going to find it difficult to establish and maintain friendships. We're going to find that this kind of attitude leads to isolation and loneliness. Whereas a more open-handed, generous approach to life makes others and ourselves happier in the long term, makes friendships easier, makes life go easier. This is something that the Buddha himself recommended, that lay people enjoy their wealth, that they spend on themselves and others to make them happy. Often we may find the workings of Buddhist karma to be obscure, but much of what the Buddha teaches as karma is actually based upon deep psychological truths. The miserliness that many of us feel may lead to our inability to give freely to others without second guessing, and for the same reason may lead to our inability to really enjoy ourselves, to really enjoy the fruits of our labors, if you like. Or, put another way, the bad karma that results from our regretting or second-guessing generosity that we've displayed can lead to our own lack of happiness in the future. The upshot from the Buddha here is that we should all learn to be open-handed in our generosity and to give without regrets. always understanding that we do so in a sustainable and affordable way. The Buddha never expected us to give more than we could afford. Now, this general question of whether and to what extent everything that we experience is due to past karma is a critical one if we're going to understand Buddhist karma correctly. And I did a video about that very topic a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you want to learn more about that. Thanks so much. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing. Thanks again, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.